Two people are sat in a room, a suspect and a detective. There's no crime and there is no conflict, but the detective has a suspicion that the person opposite them is a robot. Well, you've seen the scene in Blade Runner. Inhuman Conditions is a game by Tommy Maranges and Cory about the tension between the words, the unconscious actions, and the pressure.
And perhaps best of all, it's a party game that takes 5 minutes.
But that's not it. Don't get me wrong, it's great for a fun time, but playing as a detective, don't you get a bit uneasy? That feeling of authoritarianism? Oh, yeah. You're deciding the value of a specific life, and it shouldn't feel that uneasy because it actually lacks consequence for you.
Yeah, look, this isn't a game where you should come into it focused on winning or losing. No, in spite of this impeccable and beautiful production with these stamps that determine life and death on these horrible bureaucratic forms, it is a rule set almost entirely focused on creating a narrative between the two players, independent of the board in front of you. It's a charged and tense interplay between the vulnerable accused and the paranoid accuser.
And it's a party game that takes 5 minutes? Alright, so a quick explanation on how it plays. Two players will sit opposite each other, the box between them. The investigator will draw a module. Perhaps we'll be exploring the suspect's happiness, their threat assessment skills, or maybe their self-image. The module set up a line of questioning that'll help you determine what's going on, all interrogating a character that you'll collaboratively design, choosing a name and a background. This is also a good time to maybe experiment with some accents and voices. The problem is that I'm bad at voices.
There are other elements of performance though.
The suspect will be handed a random card which also decides if they're a human or a robot, and then you start the timer. 5 minutes, 5 whole minutes of freeform questioning where you closely watch to see if the other player has any particular avoidances or tics.
And if they're human, well, they have nothing to fear, but they might also be told they're a robot, or worse, violent robot. Now, robots have a list of things that they can't do, else they'll have to perform a sort of tick, which is presented between the players at the beginning of the game and decided on together. These are actually quite hard to pull off, which means that as a robot, you'll be looking for chances to fit it in and constantly referencing the card, but every time you do that, it ratchets up the investigator's paranoia.
It's things like raising your hands off the table or like complimenting the other player?
Yeah, not usually subtle things, but they can be done. A violent robot, on the other hand, has a small list of tasks, and as they complete them, their aggression level increases. Once they get to the end, they slam down that red stamp and kill the investigator outright. But the investigator is also watching them, and if they notice that behavior, they punch the guilty verdict beforehand and win.
That mechanic, that single mechanic is the entire tension of this game. Within 5 minutes, you need to stamp that performance review. But if you're comfortable or complacent, maybe the other player is going to grab that, slather it with some stamps as an act of vengeance. It's certainly not much of a game. The detective can ask whatever they want. The suspect can be as goofy or as serious as they'd like to be, but it is a guided collaborative effort that's comforting, yet quick enough that if you've told a poor or uninteresting story, you can just stamp a page and move on.
Yeah, that simulation of the classic Voight-Kampff interrogation scene from Blade Runner is really what makes this game a treat. And it does open this super accessible door to role-playing that instead of having to roll dice and spend hours writing a backstory with somebody, you fill out the form and you riff on it. It's so quick, it's so light. That can make it maybe feel a little bit like baby's first Dungeons and Dragons, but what it does is, unlike every other board game trying to play in the role-playing game space, it takes away those hours of combat, it takes away the grindy dungeon crawling, and it gets to that wonderful, just beautiful creative inspiration that is at the heart of my favorite role-playing sessions.
I guess the detective is kind of the dungeon master, but instead of a storyteller, they're just a bit of a fascist.
Well, it does absolutely let you kind of relish that bureaucratic hell Hollywood villain. Oh, it's so good.
Actually, much like Secret Hitler, another game by Tommy Maranges, it antagonizes them in kind of a comical way. In Secret Hitler, everyone at the table is pretending to be good. Some of them are bad, and one player is Hitler. And the whole game is this back and forth of posturing and, deception that ends in either Hitler being shot, losing from absolute irrelevance, or winning through lies that let the players laugh at them. It draws the power away from Hitler by mocking him. The sales line of the game is literally you're a group of people trying to defeat him and he's this lowly, lying scum. Likewise, Inhuman Conditions often ends in laughter at the detective failing their mission, missing obvious cues, making dumb assumptions about behavior, and proving themselves that they're picking up on false positives. In games where detectives win, it's to the dismay of the opposing player. Honestly, the game is at its weakest when there's a victory, because it feels like a setup with no punchline, and that's a feeling shared on both sides of the table.
Yeah, and look, maybe we haven't investigated the role of the opposing player too much. They are they get to go on this wonderful journey where they weave this wild kind of off-the-rails story. You get to make jokes and kind of pop off this ridiculous premise, like maybe you're the second most richest man in the world discussing the stress problems, or maybe you've been sponsored by an energy drink company and you have to discuss your personal moral failings.
Yeah, but so little of the game actually lets you play. Unfortunately, your story is just set dressing for the other player to put their scope onto. Inhuman Conditions sometimes wants you to think of it as a party game, where it can be fun to watch these elaborate yet succinct improvised roles play out, but in reality, you'll be watching the least interesting part of the game without controlling any of the mechanics or doing the paperwork that actually builds a wealth of suspense. I've watched this played. It's not great. It's kind of improv night with a time limit.
Yeah, look, with that said, I've seen people have heaps and heaps of fun with the additional rules that they pack into this game to allow up to 20 players to play. There's a couple of great scenarios. There's like one where you have a team of janitors and they're trying to determine which of their robotic staff of Roombas is a murderer. There's one where a bunch of androids are sort of cross-checking each other before they go to market to figure out if any of them are defective. These are just, this game is so wonderfully flavorful. I love it every step of the way for that part of it. And these are absolutely a good time, but they maybe don't capture the one-on-one kind of strength of the core game.
And maybe that's what it is, or maybe for me it's just hard to invest into watching a game with so little rules to it. And, you know, naturally the humor that comes from playing one-on-one doesn't necessarily translate to that third or fourth or fifth person watching. You know, maybe this game is great for when you're, you know, still playing games after everyone's starting to leave and this is just the last thing you play of the night, or as an opener before a social deduction heavy night.
Or I'd also recommend it to players who are just being introduced to roleplay and don't want the pressure of a whole group watching them.
I don't know if that's what it is. As someone who doesn't enjoy many roleplay games, this actually hits the spot for me because it's so confined and, you know, controlled, which is what roleplay often isn't, and that's why this is a great game for me.
Yeah, it could also be for you because you completely lack all imagination. He wrote that, I'm not mean.
He is mean, he's so mean, but stamping is very fun.
Yes, and look, that is maybe genuinely the reason to buy this game instead of just going on the print to play, which is easily available online, but the stamps are so good.
And it's a party game that takes 5 minutes.